Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We're talking national political news of the day. And I think that our first topic is going to be kind of generically Congress, specifically the House. Where is it going? A lot has happened over the past few days. The committees are being formed. Somebody has already filed for an impeachment of Mayorkas, of course, who is uh, basically the head of what's happening at the border. There is going to be a committee on the weaponization of government, which the Democrats are calling the tinfoil hat committee. They are not going to make the same mistake that the Republicans made last year. They are going to be on every single select committee that is formed. They're not going to boycott anything. That really kind of backfired on the Republicans last year. Trump was even really mad at them for it. They've already passed a bill to repeal the IRS funding that passed last year, but there's not even going to be any movement in the Senate. They're probably going to pass a slew of bills that the Senate isn't even going to act on. There's already ethics complaints against Santos. McCarthy, of course, the new guy who's been caught in all sorts of lies. The Republican Party in his own district is calling for his resignation, but McCarthy, in classic politically brave form, said he was elected, so he should stay. And the big question about these new rules with McCarthy are they going to lead to government shutdowns? A lot of stuff to discuss in this, but I think the biggest hot news is they're probably going to set up a committee to investigate the classified documents of Joe Biden that have been discovered in two locations over the past couple of days. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between that. They're trying to make parallels with Trump. Huge differences between the two. It was sloppy and irresponsible on the part of Biden and his people that this happened, but it's not the same thing by any stretch of imagination. But that's not stopping the House from trying to make a big deal about it, other than the fact that President Biden, first of all, reported it. His people reported it to the DOJ, turned it over without any kind of fight, and are fully cooperating with any investigation to clean up any messes. There's no lawsuit. They didn't have to be raided by the FBI, in order to get the stuff. I mean, it was the only reason we know about it is because Biden and his people turned it in. But the House is going to investigate it, so we've got a lot going on with the House. Ever since McCarthy did manage to win, my prediction went down in flames. He did manage to win, largely because Trump got on the phone with the majority of the 20, and got 14 of them to switch and 6 of them to vote present to make it all happen. So a lot going on with the House. The Senate is kind of boring right now. Not much happening except that the Democrats are getting ready to jam a bunch of judicial and other nominations down through. Now that they've got 51 voters, it does appear that that there will be 51, that she will caucus down in Arizona there, will caucus with the Democrats, at least for those purposes. So where do you want to start with the House, Dave?
Yeah, so I think big picture, big picture, there's the issue of Democrats controlling the Senate, Democrats controlling the White House, and Republicans in the House, with limited to nil chance of railroading through anything too controversial, basically. So it's not one of those situations where we have to be overly concerned about their agenda reaching our lives. But that's not to say that their agenda won't reverberate across the media ecosystem to dictate the coverage and the things that we talk about and the things that that over the next 2 years leading up to the 2024 election. So that's like big picture. This is really confined. I'd like to basically I'm confining the conversation to what's going to happen in the House. So obviously we know, I mean, it seems like a long time ago, but it was just Friday that the 15 rounds of voting took place in order for McCarthy to become the speaker. And there were, he got the necessary votes because there were only 5 people that ended up saying present, which didn't count as votes against him, and it actually lowered the threshold of votes that he needed to reach the critical mass. It was 218, effectively leading up to that point, but then the votes that he did get was enough. So that just happened, and they're hitting the ground running. It's not that dissimilar to Newt Gingrich when he took over back along, I don't remember the year right now, 94 maybe. And he had 100 days, first 100 days all mapped out to push through all sorts of things, including rules changes. So I think it's not quite that frenetic, but the rules are a big deal. So I want to just mention that as I think a good starting point on the substance here is that the speaker has greatly weakened himself by making it so that any single, we talked about this last week, any single person he's agreed to that could at any given time give like hold a no confidence vote, a motion to vacate, basically kick the speaker out, make him step down, make him lose a power. So that's one element of it, but there was a bunch of other elements too that include things like the Freedom Caucus folks end up, which were the dissenting group, they end up with a third of the seats on the Rules Committee, which gives them a significant amount of power when it comes to the day-to-day operations. They've also been negotiating presence on lots of committees. Like I heard Marjorie Taylor Greene say, "Oh, she had gotten kicked off of all the committees. She's just happy to be on a committee." So that's not something we could take lightly. Some of these committees are significant and influential, and they're getting presence there. But also, there's more mundane things like just the ability of the rank and file to be able to get their voice heard on the floor and have amendments considered, because in the current system, everything goes through the leadership, and the leadership is somewhat stifling. And I think this sounds like minutia, but it's also pretty important in that right now, or like the most recent past, as long back as I can remember, a bill will be presented and then they'll have to vote on it within hours or minimum amount of time. It could be thousands of pages, and only certain staffers have access to it before the final version comes out. You don't even know what's all in there. So there's that piece of it that they're demanding a 3-day period of time.
Yeah.
Yep, and then also they're going to try to put a rule in place that says that that bills have to be germane. That if it says it's about food, it's got to be about food. If it says it's about energy, it's got to be about energy. Right now, it's like a free for all where things just get tucked in where they can. So that's sort of the day-to-day stuff that I think. In hindsight, at the time, I'm sorry, like in the near future, or medium or long-term future, we'll look back and say some of those things were actually small d democratic, beneficial to minority groups within any party. But that's the silver lining here. These are the good things, and I'll like kick it to you in a sec. But there are other things that we could talk about that are not so good, which is in addition to that agreement for those 5 people to agree for McCarthy to be speaker, there's talk, and some people have said they've actually seen it, like 3 additional pages of things they have agreed to push through, which basically means it's theatrics, so that they can have their pet projects and pet issues and access to grind be made public. And they're going to take votes to try to hold people to account on things that maybe people aren't quite aware of yet, like structural and dismantling of things like entitlement spending, balancing the budget in 10 years, all sorts of things that are not very popular we're going to see come up.
Well, let me ask you, do you think much is going to get done in terms of legislation that's actually going to pass over the next 2 years? Because we did see a little bit of pushback from the moderates who were in all those close elections, that were there last week, and they're not exactly happy. They understand why McCarthy did it, but they're not exactly happy about what he did. And so are they going to push back, and will they cross over and vote with Democrats just to get something done so that when they get back to their really close razor thin elections in the few competitive districts that we have left, they can say they did something?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $99 question. so in the set of things that the Republican majority is going to put forward, there are probably a lot of things that are not going to be bipartisan and that will get zero traction outside of the House. I'm going to say grandstanding, but that might be too judgmental. But that's
like the IRS bill to
sure.
take back the funding. They know the Senate isn't even going to discuss it in committee, let alone vote on it.
Absolutely.
So, is it all going to be just stuff like that? Are they going to pass more repeal Obamacare, which they pass whenever they know it can't pass? I mean, it's just.
Yeah. No, great questions, obviously. So yeah, my take on this, and again, it's very early. It's the 11th, right? It's like he's been speaker since the committees, everybody's been sworn in, and everything's happened like just not even a whole week yet. So we don't really know. But my hunch, my reflection, my guess is that we will not see very much substantive things come out, but that you're right, your inclination, your premise here, I think is right on. Like I saw, for example, Republican Congress member from Texas, last name Gonzalez, and I'm not sure, I don't remember what district he was from, but I saw him speak over the weekend, and he said basically like, look, we're not going to let the insurrection caucus of my party, get away with things that are harmful, and we are going to collaborate with our colleagues across the aisle on things that are necessary. And this is, I thought that was pretty good. I didn't expect to hear something like that so soon. And so yeah, there are theoretically things that, like, for example, immigration. We'll talk about two big things during this time. I think we should.
Sure, but let me ask you real quickly, because I don't want to lose track of this, and we'll get into immigration in a minute, because there may actually be some bipartisan action on that.
Yeah.
But what about the Hastert rule? Do you think that there will be Republicans who do that? And then that's referred to also as the majority of the majority rule, where Hastert was a Republican, I think, senator, I'm not sure, but who basically managed to get the Republicans to agree that even when that they would never vote for a bill that the majority of them didn't support. So, for instance, there would never be a bill that would pass that all of the Democrats and 30 Republicans would support if all the rest of the Republicans were opposed to it. And I'm wondering if that rule is going to remain in place this time around, because the Republicans don't have a lot of space to work with, and if some of those people start breaking off, I mean, what are they going to do? They want to go back and brag to their constituents about how they're not Trumpers, about how they're not captive to the extremists, because these are districts where there are people who are voting not necessarily for a party, a lot of them anyway, but for for somebody who gets something done. So let me just ask you about that.
Yeah, I think so. There are purple district Republicans, meaning that they have got Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Granted, most of the districts have been polarized, hyper-polarized, but there are, there's a critical mass of moderates out there too. And so the question is, will McCarthy be an effective and calculating enough speaker to prevent those types of bills from making it to the floor? And that might be the case, consistent with, I think the rule you're talking about, I think that was Denny Hastert. I think that's who that was.
Yes.
Yeah. So I my thought on that is that there is space for in the new rule set for, once a bill is out there, for all sorts of things to happen, and it'll be a lot harder to control once it makes it to the floor. But sometimes the question is, will McCarthy and the Republican leadership be able to be calculating enough on a bill by bill basis to make sure bills don't make it to the floor? And that they very well could, because that's sort of the status quo right now. So it could be the case that they excel at limiting what makes it to the floor.
Yeah, well, and then I wonder then if some of these Republicans don't want to go down for the party, and they not necessarily switch to Democrats, but pull a cinema or and go independent, and maybe not even caucus with the Republicans at a certain point. I mean, these people want to be reelected. And right now, it's not looking good for them.
Yeah, so I would like, if you don't mind, I know we only have a couple minutes left on the segment already, but just rather than track to immigration first, I was going to give two examples. Let's track to the big one that's going to come up really quick, which is the debt ceiling. So, we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of what it is and why it's important or not important. But the point is that in that 3 pages of things that they've agreed to, it appears that there's been an agreement to make a major stand on the premise that the Republicans will not approve of a increase of the debt ceiling without major commitments to spending cuts. And the baseline for that is 2022 budget, 0 increases across the board except for defense, because there's no Republican dissent to defense. But so maybe not all sorts of drastic systematic structural changes, but they have they must have some moral victory in mind about speaking about a balanced budget over time. They're talking about 10 years. It might take 20 years in reality. I think that's what McCarthy was trying to say. Is I agree with you guys in principle of a balanced budget, but your 10-year goal is cut to the bone and way too drastic for reality. But I think maybe he's just gonna sort of have to let them get embarrassed when they say we are going to shut down the government and we are going to let the full faith and credit of the United States go into default, or you guys agree to cut to the bone. So I think that we're going to just within just a few months, we're going to see a standoff, and we're going to see if in fact it all breaks apart in the name of fiscal austerity.
All right. Well, it's very early, and there's a lot that we could discuss about it. But maybe we should wait a couple of weeks and see where the House actually goes on all this stuff.
Yeah.
We did have an intense conference, and it's intense for a purpose. We have worked for a long time. I've been leader for 4 years. I came into this position, we had less than 200 members. We are now sitting in the majority. We put forth to the American public a commitment to America. There's times we're going to have to argue with our own members if they're looking for only positions for themselves, not for the country. For the last 2 months, we worked together as a whole conference to develop rules that empower all members. But we're not empowering certain members over others. Last night I was presented the only way to have 218 votes if I provided certain members with certain positions, certain gavels, to take over church committee, to have certain budgets. And they even came to the position where one, Matt Gaetz, said, I don't care if we go to plurality and we elect Hakeem Jeffries and it hurts the new frontline members not to get reelected. Well, that's not about America.
All right. I don't want to get too much in these early January and February months about the horse race. One of the criticisms I have received of the show is that we don't spend enough time on policy and political philosophy. Our next segment will deal a little bit with philosophical stuff, but there's no way we cannot discuss the California Senate race, which began yesterday. Of course, Dianne Feinstein is either 89 currently or turns 89 this year. A lot of questions about her cognitive abilities after a couple of events at hearings that we could review if you want. She repeated questions and stuff. But also a lot of questions about whether or not her brand of politics of centrist, maybe left of center in certain issues, right of center in others, really represents California at this time. At any rate, there are already now 2 candidates in the mix, and probably a number more. This could become quite the fiasco. Katie Porter was the first to declare. It was kind of interesting because last week she was caught on film in camera reading a book, something about the art of not giving an F. So she's being criticized for not having waited for Feinstein to announce her retirement. There's a lot of pressure on her to retire, but sometimes they take their sweet time, and she's wanting to start raising money for it. She's in a district that got even tougher under the redistricting. So she would have a hard time getting reelected to the House, as she did this time, barely won. So she's making a play for the Senate. Today, Barbara Lee told the Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, she, of course, is the one who represents Berkeley and Oakland, replaced the long time Ron Dellums about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And she is 76 years old, but she is running on a platform that, the Harris should have been replaced by a African American woman. She wants to be the standard bearer for that. But other people may run. Adam Schiff, for instance, might run. Ro Khanna is thinking of running, but he's also being played around as replacing Bernie Sanders as the standard bearer for progressives and running for president if Biden doesn't run. And last but not least, well, Eric Garcetti is another potential candidate, even though it looks like he's going to be the ambassador to India. And even Gavin Newsom, if Biden doesn't resign, may make a play for it. There are a lot of rumors going around. So this Senate race is out there. And remember, we don't have regular primaries here. So a Republican will be involved. At least one Republican will be in that race as well. This could be a very exciting Senate race coming up. But Katie Porter certainly not waiting around for Feinstein to make up her mind.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where it's hard to imagine that it doesn't like cascade into some circular firing squad. Not that unlike what we saw in the House last week, because there's the tradition in polite society to wait for a senator to declare their intentions, whether they're going to run or not. And clearly, Katie didn't do that.
Nope.
So by coming out when she did, that's on her. That's her choice. She can take the hits for not waiting. But I think it's important to note that when it comes to Senator Feinstein, while a trailblazer and icon, and there's no one, I think, thinks that she wasn't substantially highly regarded for decades, right? Like she literally, like, everything good you could say about her, except the fact that she's still there.
She became mayor after the Moscone was killed. She was appointed mayor, which she was actually thinking of retiring back then. I was not a fan of her status as mayor. As I said before the show, she never met a high-rise she didn't like. I think she's partly responsible for why San Francisco is now so gentrified and why it looks like Manhattan now, with all the tall buildings. But she is more of a centrist than most other politicians, and maybe that's just not where California is anymore. We'll find out.
Yeah. And my other thought on that, just to wrap up with Dianne Feinstein, was that staff members of hers have already come out and leaked pretty widely for at least a year, in my recollection, probably a little bit longer, that it's time for lots of reasons. I don't need to disparage her in any way. There's enough out there, but a lot of people are saying it's time. So I guess the writing was on the wall, and then the truth is, if there was some stubborn indecision on her part not to decide, somebody was going to be the first one to step up. So I think it was inevitable that there's going to be Democratic field out there for this spot.
And let's just say that Katie Porter tends to be a little bit iconoclastic. She wants to be known as the one who breaks the rules, and she'll probably take a lot of flack from within the party, but people in general are going to say, wow, she's the leader. She stepped up, before all the others did, and that's probably good for about 4 or 5 points in the polling at a certain point. So, we'll see. They're going to appreciate it. And of course, she's been extremely effective, famous for her, whiteboard, stuff in the House, and also effective in winning in a Republican-favored district. Consistently. So, she's somebody who could aspire to be president someday, claiming, hey, I can appeal to the red states, so anyway.
And for folks who don't know, I think she was a law school professor, studied under Elizabeth Warren. So there's this history, this knowledge base, this skill set, this social critique establishment critique that she's got, and not just in training, but also she's earned it, like you said, with the whiteboards. But that's a double-edged sword, because she was extremely unpopular with party leadership because of her willingness to bite the hand that feeds them. So, for example, the classic case is JP Morgan Chase Bank CEO Jamie Dimon, who she, very sharp tongue undressed about the cost of living. And so while not that it matters what I think about it, but there are plenty of critiques out there that Elizabeth Warren and Katie Porter could make of establishment financial system and campaign finance. But this was a little bit more personal. But that's what got her popular, that her base loves it. The progressive community in California is majority Bernie supporters, and therefore is majority progressive. And so that's she's got enemies within her own party for sure.
And even from the progressives, Barbara Lee is kind of resentful because I think she saw herself as the standard bearer of progressive. Now she's going to have to fight for the progressive vote, as will Ro Khanna if he decides to run again. I'm thinking that Biden may announce that he's not running again. We'll see. Although his approval ratings have been ticking up lately. He's up to, I think, an average of 44% right now. So we'll see. But does he have the capacity to run? We don't. We're all, we don't know. But that's but going up against somebody like Adam Schiff too, who is sharp, much more in tune with the party, who will probably draw most of the money for the party, although Porter is a great fundraiser too. And then Barbara Lee running to her left. Nothing is certain. It's going to be a tough race. I don't know that we can compare this to last week in terms of this. I think what it's going to look like is a typical presidential primary when there is no standard bearer to establish that standard bearer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was almost being tongue in cheek there by calling it a circular firing squad. It's more of a natural shakeout of who's got the most juice within the party. But I want to mention too, just because maybe it doesn't, the parallel isn't exactly the same. But when Bernie Sanders was running for president, the Ragin' Cajun Carvel was out there saying that it would be the end of the world as we know it if he won the primary. And he was out there already last night commenting on Katie Porter. And rather than getting to, he wasn't super hyperbolic about it, but what he said, he's basically said was that, hey, this is, there's going to be other people showing up at this card game. And he was he was a little bit dismissive. He was a little bit like, look, the establishment is not going to be for her, and the establishment has a lot of money in the bank and resources, and Katie gets the first mover advantage. She gets the limelight for a day or a week or a month, but the party's going to come gunning for her in a big way, I'm sure.
Oh, definitely. But like I said, I think there's going to be more than two people there, and I'm going to have a prediction as to who the party mainstream is going to put in there at the end of the show. But this is wild though, because this is going to lead to some very interesting policy discussions here. She is progressive, but not as progressive as Barbara Lee in theory. I don't know. I actually haven't heard much from Barbara Lee in recent years. So it's just other than she was like the only one in the House to vote against the Afghan war resolution back then. She kind of stood for things, but it seems like she's been grooming herself for this run. But there's plenty of other people that want that seat too. I mean, it's not that is going to be a very coveted seat for a lot of people.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think that when it comes to, my assessment of experience, talent, and timing, the question is, Ro Khanna's got most of that going on, but I think he's got bigger aspirations, as you alluded to. Like he could just as easily be vice president as senator, versus Barbara Lee, who really does seem sort of the slipper, the Sleeping Beauty. I think the slipper fits here. It just seems the right person at the right time with the right experience. That's my hunch on this, regardless of what my opinion of Katie Porter. So again, I'm thankful she's out there, and I think that, like you said, there's going to be a food fight and a lot of substance out there, which is fantastic. But the party, I don't think there's so another piece of this is I don't think there's too much risk of a Republican candidate really having a victory. The question is, are there going to be two Democrats facing off in the general, which I think is likely.
Very likely.
Yeah, and then the question is which two, who's going to be the standard bearer for the establishment, who's going to be the standard bearer for the progressives. And it's very possible that some arrangement is arrived at where if Barbara Lee truly is, if people do rally around her, that some of the others will sort of fall in line. So it might just be Barbara Lee and Katie Porter out there. Is in the general, if she continues the approach of like what she's done in the House, where she enjoys being provocative, she enjoys going for the limelight when it comes to her rational critique, putting working families first. Working families are not typically first in our national politics, and so again, I think it's going to be a robust fight for the Senate seat, but it's really important nationally, just because if you look at the Democratic Party in Congress, the Senate is different, of course, because every state just gets two people, but in the House, an awful lot of the representatives are from like California and New York, and if you add a couple other states, like Illinois and there's like three states or so that end up being like almost the majority of the Democratic Party in the House. So really the question is, what does the California Democratic Party, who do they decide to support? Because that's going to carry a ton of weight here.
Yeah, well, and not only that, who do the progressives support between Barbara Lee and Katie Porter? If they're going to be going to all of the different progressive groups, and that's going to be a tough decision. And I think we're going to hear discussion about race in this. I think we're going to hear discussions about how your seniority and how long you've done and what your history, your voting record history is. So that'll be very interesting. One thing neither of us has considered. We discussed her at the beginning of the segment, but in these last couple of minutes, do you want to talk about, is there a possibility that Feinstein does try to hold on?
Interesting. I would discount that enough.
I think so.
Yeah. Just for all things being equal, taking office at 91 and leaving office at 97, that's probably a bridge too far at this point, I think.
I would think so too. I think if there was any doubt about it, I think Katie Porter made that decision for her, because now with a second candidate in there and probably a third or fourth once the storms are over, everybody's using the storms as an excuse. Ro Khanna says, I agree with Dianne Feinstein on this. We're dealing with bad weather issues, blah blah blah, and I'm not even sure what what's his name said. God, my brain.
Adam Schiff.
Yeah, Adam Schiff. I looked for comments from him, and he's just laying low. And the rest, and Gavin Newsom is just staying totally out of it. So even though he's kind of the party leader, and right now Gavin Newsom is talking about having to make cuts this year as opposed to last year with big surpluses, with the anticipated lower revenues. We'll see. But at any rate.
And so I know we're not fully out of time, but we're really close. If it was the case that Gavin Newsom was going to make a run for the presidency, you couldn't have two folks both from California, in good faith be running. That would clear a lane for Ro Khanna to step in and fight for the Senate seat instead. So he's not out of the consideration yet.
Meet Bob Burns.
In TV ads like this one, an unexpected and risky strategy.
And I'm an America First candidate.
Burns follows the Trump playbook on immigration, the border, and guns.
What at first glance looks like a typical campaign message for a Republican primary candidate is actually an ad paid for by Democrats.
Democrat serve is responsible for the content of this ad.
Democrats boosting his candidacy are essentially rolling the dice.
An agenda too conservative for Illinois.
It's part of a national strategy.
Donald Trump's hand-picked candidate for Maryland governor. Cox worked with Trump, trying to prove the last election was a fraud.
Handpicked by Trump to run for Congress, Gibbs called Trump the greatest president.
Republican Chris Matisse, a true conservative, 100% pro-Trump.
All right, final segment. Wanted to talk a little bit, get into a little bit of the philosophical here by request, actually from multiple people who have suggested that we spend too much time on horse races and sort of surface level party politics, and wanting to get into a little bit more, not just in policy, but philosophical. And so the question I want to put forth here is the year, there are several articles out there that have been written. Financial Times, the year the strongmen stumbled. Esquire, I think, wrote, was 2022 the demise of the strongman politics? And by strongman, we mean that there is a movement, a populist movement with a strong leader that claims to go against the powers that be, is the maverick, all of that. And of course, we're talking in this country about Donald Trump, but also a few others who want to be in that situation. And we are watching sort of a decline in some other countries of the strongman, certainly not where there is a democracy. Strongmen in a dictatorship can stay in power, but we're seeing that Putin's image around the world has declined, even though a lot of countries aren't necessarily jumping on the bandwagon to oppose him. He is not in the same statesmanship status of statesman as he was a couple of years ago. Same thing with China. Same thing in India. We've got strongmen in winning in Hungary, and a strong woman in Italy, possibly, although she hasn't really taken any steps. But one key, and Netanyahu in Israel seems to have consolidated his power once again. But Bolsonaro is out. He lost an election, challenged it, took a page out of Trump's book, and there was even a storming of the Capitol. Well, they don't call it the Capitol there, but their legislative building, with a lot of trashing going on, people in jail and the rest. And Bolsonaro, interestingly enough, is actually in Florida right now. There are calls to deport him for having at least there's implications that he was involved in organizing. I believe a relative, a son or a nephew or something of Bolsonaro was actually at Mar-a-Lago briefly. Son. Okay, thank you. But so clearly it's not getting him anywhere in Brazil. The military did not back Bolsonaro, obviously, so he gave up power voluntarily, but is putting up a protest as he can. So the question is, for American politics, is this model of strongman politics on the decline now that Trump is losing his status? Maybe he regained a little bit last week when he, basically muscled some of the 20 into supporting McCarthy. Is DeSantis, is he the equivalent of a strongman, in terms of the model that we're talking about? And it's a hard thing to define, but it is characterized by populism and basically following your own rules and breaking rules and claiming power that maybe you're not entitled to. It's hard to come up with a working definition. I looked that up today, and it's sort of an I know it when I see it type of thing. But we definitely have a lot of Americans supporting authoritarianism, even supported a coup if he could have to stay in power or reclaim power. Is that behind us?
Certainly not fully behind us. The question is it on the decline, I think. And so there's a question of if you are sort of oversimplifying, not you personally, but one were to oversimplify by using broad strokes versus looking at a granular level. And so you frame this around Bolsonaro. I think it's worth mentioning that there are many, many criminal investigations into his behavior as an authoritarian strongman, including the way he handled COVID. That's considered, malicious neglect by downplaying it and the approach that they took. But all sorts of corruption, all sorts of, like, for example, skimming money off staff members' payroll so that they could divert funds to the family's investments. These are all allegations, but investments in real estate, like hundreds of real estate transactions that personally benefit him, all sorts of corruption in the agribusiness, privatization efforts like Petrobras, the state oil company, national oil company, like literally such a massive track record of harms to society. And so when you're an authoritarian strongman with a cult of personality, it's a little bit easier to be that belligerent in your leadership. And, we have similar strains of that we've seen with Trump. And so when Trump's taxes were released last week, I've heard a bunch of tax experts talking about just, what are the examples of things that he could be found criminally liable for or civilly liable for in the way he conducts his finances. And so that, like step by step, just oversight and scrutiny is knocking folks down a peg. I don't know about ultimate and accountability in quotes. I don't know if that's ever going to happen for him personally, but those are the granular sort of looks at like what happens when you're authoritarian. In Ukraine, there was, the leader that was in before the revolution, known to be, gold-plated toilets.
Yes.
And there are other, in the Philippines, Maduro, he had death squads killing drug dealers in the streets. And so just these simple solutions that are not democratic, that are not respectful of human rights and dignity, that may be on the decline because of its conflict with modern and contemporary mainstream values of how a society ought to be run, which could undermine Putin, and he's certainly on the decline too. So your overall, that's a long-winded way of saying, I think on a person-by-person basis that the authoritarianism is in decline, and strongman politics, more broadly, it's probably in decline. But we certainly have not seen the end of it because we know that these people are prominent and likely to push back.
And people look for heroes, and they want to back individuals more than they want to back movements. It's it's part of our culture. It's part of every culture, especially patriarchal culture. I don't want to sound vulgar in saying that or oversimplifying, but that is the way it is. But I do want to refer people to an article in the Financial Times, if you Google it, written by Gideon Rockman called "The Year the Strongman Stumbled," and it does kind of take a strong look at all of the countries where it has. Boris Johnson lost. I don't know that I would put him in the same category as these other people like Orban or Bolsonaro, but Orban certainly hasn't stumbled. He's in full power in Hungary, and he's a darling of CPAC here, the conservative organizations. They love him. But Trump, as the article says, an instinctive authoritarian, recently praised Xi, Chinese premier, for ruling China with an iron fist, quote unquote. That's what Trump said, praised him for it. His own bubble seems to be deflating rapidly following the Republican Party's surprisingly weak performance in the midterm election. His decline demonstrates the crucial distinction between strongman politics in democracies and in authoritarian systems. In countries where democratic institutions remain robust, it is possible to lever a strongman out through the ballot box. And that is, of course, a big deal. But the character of the strongman isn't just that they have this power, this governmental power and police power and all the rest. They tend to be popular, if not with the majority, with a movement that's strong enough to back it up and enforce it on the streets, sometimes through terror. We saw attempts at that over the 4 years of Trump's rule, and actually even since then. And so, and we've got this. We had the January 6th committee that basically outlined how he attempted to keep power against the democracy. But there's still a lot of people, even a lot of the media, that's like, well, that's Donald Trump. Well, there's a desensitization to it that is concerning to me. And my fear is that somebody else comes in who's actually more subtle and more effective than Trump, actually smarter. Who will hire, employ somebody with a bit more brains than Eastman to concoct a plan that after Trump has already tested the waters. My question is do you think DeSantis is a danger in that way? And he's the Florida governor right now, really effective for his party. He's completely turned Florida into a red state for the moment. Loves to play the populist ticket, loves to play the I don't compromise ticket, is doing all kinds of stuff as a rogue, because people like rogues and people like mavericks and the rest until they're actually do something. But, that is completely roguish against the system. But at any rate, and if not DeSantis, somebody else, because this is the model of politics in the Republican Party right now. Most of them lost this last time around. Few of them won.
So I think the DeSantis question is a good one. And the point that you make is that what if someone is more effective, knowledgeable, creative, popular, and persuasive, right? So DeSantis has indeed captured the attention of national Republican audience. Greg Abbott to a much lesser extent in Texas, I would argue, but it's similar tactics. So I actually do talk to Republicans quite a bit to try to get to what's the gray matter. Like, what are they thinking about things like the authoritarian, slippage and the lack of tangible policy aspirations that they have. Like, what are they really for, as opposed to let's block everything. I'll comment on that a little bit more in the predictions about what are they really for. But when it comes to someone like DeSantis, I do think we're going to see a national confrontation that really will sort of, I suspect, elevate the dialogue, because it will force Democrats in opposition to DeSantis, whoever the presidential candidate happens to be, to really engage about the criticism. And maybe that's a little bit overly optimistic that it's going to happen in the next 2 years, but certainly over the next couple of cycles, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, as we go forward. There is a real, the reason DeSantis is popular in part is because he's tapping into real concerns about the direction society's taking, real grievances. And you could say the same thing for the Republicans in the House about, we don't have to get super into the weeds on this, but is it a risk? It's a huge risk, because it appears that there's not a plan that is going to be constructive. It's more of holding things back, and that I think is a little bit disappointing for anybody that wants to really get down to the nitty gritty. And for example, with immigration, the only way that you deal with immigration is comprehensively. You can't just arm up and create a barrier and a military confrontation. You have to actually engage the folks who go back and forth all the time for work, and the folks who are adding to the economy and adding to the future of the country, and on every level. And you just have to be realistic about it, about what the future ought to look like. And honestly, I think both parties have a lot of growth when it comes to cultivating leadership that's going to engage on behalf of the vast majority of people.
Yeah, well, right now in Florida, you have teachers that are getting fired or threatened with being fired for suggesting books, not assigning books, but suggesting books to students that are not on the favored list. And we're not talking about these books that have graphic sexual stuff or say things like, whiteness is bad or whatever, that type of thing. We're talking, the irony of Fahrenheit 459 is on one one of the book suspects list. Here you got you're banning a book about banning books. I mean, it's an issue of that he's going to be attacked for, but he loves this, or the fact that he went on the stage grandstanding about the 20 people who were had voted illegally. And these were people who didn't even realize they had voted illegally and were voting with because officials told them they could, right? But most of them were African American, and it scared other people from voting when he did this. I mean, people who had been convicted. A lot of people believe that in Florida, if you're convicted of a felony, you're not allowed to vote. That's not true. It's absolutely not true. But they managed to slip some stuff in. I don't want to get into the weeds on that either, but that nailed a few people, because you have to be in full compliance. If you forgot to pay a $200 fine on your way out of being a felon 30 years ago or something, you're not supposed to vote until that's cleared up, right? It's just, anyway, but he's not the only one. I mean, you've got some of the people that were holding up, these 20 people that think they speak for America, holding up Congress last week. I mean, just until they got what they wanted. I mean, it's not like they're math challenged. They just somehow feel like they're speaking for America. Even when Boebert barely won her, election, no less than there. Matt Gaetz, it looks like he's going to skate from going to jail. But these were the central figures in it. And we've talked about this. We will talk. Immigration is always going to be the bashing. That of any proto-fascist movement, immigrants are always like one of the first targets. That's the way it is. And, and we talked about immigration last week. We'll probably talk about it more as that comes on, because I do actually see some hope that there's going to be some bipartisanship on some aspects of that, because the price of food has been affected by it. We talked about that last week. Anyway, hard to wrap this up, but yes, no, it's not dead. It's down, but far from out. I think that's our conclusion.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to our final portion of the show. Predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
I alluded to it earlier. My prediction here is that now that Speaker McCarthy in the House has granted a wide lane for the ultra-conservative folks within the party, Freedom Caucus and Republican Study Group, etc., to say, hey, we'll hold votes on your wish list. That, I say, be careful what you wish for. This is really, unfortunately, the cliche is true. This is the dog that caught the car. And now what's it going to do? And so by them getting an open airing of their priority list, I suspect it's going to do immense harm to the overall image of Republicans in the House about their priorities and goals.
All right. I'm going to go back to the discussion of California Senate. My prediction is that neither Gavin Newsom nor Ro Khanna do declare it. At this point, they both have other aspirations, maybe run for Senate another time, but I don't think Gavin Newsom is interested in the Senate. There hasn't been a lot of discussion of that. So I do believe that the party mainstream will coalesce around Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff will be the standard bearer. He will use the clout try to draw progressives based on the based on the what he did on the January 6th committee, which makes him popular with a lot of progressives. But he will be the standard bearer, and it'll be mostly a three-way race between him, Katie Porter, and Barbara Lee. I don't think anybody else is going to step in that's really relevant. All right. With that, we will be back next week. A lot of things are heating up politically, and I will try to dedicate one section to policy or general big picture topics. So until then, stay informed and stay engaged.